Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussion series. In today's episode, I would like to talk about deck building and why we play cards in certain ratios and the ratios that we do in meta decks today. So let's go ahead and just jump right into this. This is going to be a very fun and informative video. I think this will help casual players as well as meta players kind of understand their decks a little bit better and current deck building strategies. So first of all, I would like to talk about cards that we play at 3, and here at the top row I have 3 meta examples. Those examples are Neospacian Connector, Black Metal Dragon, and Fire Formation Tenki. Now I know a lot of you guys just see these cards and they're like, oh cool, combo starters. I see these all the time in meta decks, and there's a reason why you do. You want to maximize the amount of copies of a certain card that you play when those cards get you to your full inboard combo. Now that'll be just what you want to end on at the end of your turn. Usually you want cards that kind of get you to negation based effects that interact with your opponent on their turn, but sometimes cards like Tenki get you to a zoo monster, and a zoo monster ends on just a single interruption like Trident. So when you're playing a deck, you want to analyze what it does and what it does best. So, for example, Infernoble combos really well off of multiple warriors, Dragonlane combos really well off of multiple dragons, and Zoo, quote-unquote, combos off of just one Zoo card. Now, Zoo is a bit of a unique example here because you can search any Zoo monster with this, and normally if you're searching any Zoo card outside of Ratpier on your first turn, you're just going to be ending on Trident under 4 summons to play under Nibiru, but sometimes you'll see people search Ratpier later in the game to go into a card like Megaclops. Now Megaclops itself is a towers and technically is a combo, but it is a 1-card combo. You will see Ratpier at 1 for said reason. So these are basic combo starters. Neospacian Connector in Infernoble summons out Neospacian Aqua Dolphin. You can go into Isold, and then Isold just gets you into your full combo after that. So that's why you play that card at 3. Black Metal Dragon, when it's linked off the field, searches any Red Eyes card from your deck to your hand, thus searching you Darkness Metal Dragon, and then Darkness Metal Dragon gets you to your full combo. And once again, here at Tenki, it searches your Zoo Monster gets you to Trident. So going on to cards that we play at 2 and kind of the 2 of theory. So when you're looking at your deck and you're thinking, you know, these cards aren't necessarily great to open, I have the ability to search them when I want to, you know, they don't really have a lot of use in my hand, you know, in and of themselves, you'll see why you would want to play them at 2. So an example would be Eldritch the Golden Lord in Eldritch decks. This card does have an in-hand effect that can be utilized relatively well if you're going second, but if you're going first, you're oftentimes not going to be using the discard effect on your first turn, solely because if you're doing that, you're burning a card in your hand, a card on your field, and Golden Lord itself. So you're using 3 resources to really kind of like start your engine, and if any of that gets interrupted or gets negated at some point in time, you're just losing out on a lot of resources and you kind of just fall behind in the pace of the game after that. So this card is kind of pseudo-searchable in the form of Scarlet Sanguine and your Black Elixir, because you can summon them from your deck and get them to the field, while also being able to search this card through Cursed Eldland. So there's multiple ways to get to this card. They don't do, or it doesn't do anything in and of itself as far as comboing goes. So you play this at 2 because you just don't want to see like a single copy and not be able to like recur that resource later in the game. You want to have multiple so you can kind of play in the long term. It's searchable, but just not good in your hand. Another 2 of we have here would be Destiny Hero Malicious. Now this you would play at 2 for a different reason. You would play this card at 2 solely because it is on Konami's Forbidden and Limited list on the semi-limited section of that list. This card has one hell of a history when it comes to the list because we've seen it at 1, we've seen it at 2, and we've seen it on Limited. And we may have even seen it banned at some point, I'm not quite sure. That is something I couldn't find out kind of off the cuff here. I just know that, you know, this card has been on the ban list in many different iterations, many different times. And it's not because this card is inherently a good card to search or a good card to play from your hand, but because in the modern format, if you have multiples of this card, it's basically free link material. So it's an extremely powerful card that's too strong at 3, useless at 1, and when it's banned, you know, it just doesn't make too much of a difference, especially at this point in time. So that is one reason why you might play 2 copies of a card. Now, going back to the ability to search and it just being useless in hand without any of its other counterparts, you have a card like Invocation. Invocation can be searched in multiple different ways. If you're kind of looking at the like a thought tree, you have Alistair the Invoker, which can search this card, but then you have cards like Magical Meltdown, which searches Alistair the Invoker, which searches Invocation. And then, you can go Terraform and searches Magical Meltdown, yada yada yada. You can kind of extrapolate that yourself. So Invocation in and of itself doesn't do anything to get you to your combo pieces. It doesn't do anything if you just play the card without any other accompanying cards in your hand. You want to search this card, and you want to have multiple so you can recycle it if you happen to lose one copy. So there is another reason why you might play 2 copies of a card. It just doesn't do anything, but it's integral to the playstyle of your deck. Without Invocation in any sort of Invoke deck, you're just not playing. You're unable to make your extra deck fusion monsters, Alistair can't search anything on summon, and then that engine is dead. Lastly here, another reason why you might play 2 of a card is because it has a hard once per turn clause in the card effect. So if you look at hand traps like Ash Blossom and Ogre, well, even though I might recommend playing these at 3, you will see some people playing it at 2 because you can only use the effect of this card once per turn. And that is a use, not an activate, so even if they negate the activation, you still cannot use another copy of this card. Cards with that effect generally are starter cards or very powerful cards in a deck, but you don't oftentimes see them played at 3. So you're going to have niche circumstances where if you're deck building and you have maybe some additional space in your deck, you can fit in like a 2 of like Ash Blossom or Ogre, or maybe another Ghost Girl that has a hard once per turn effect. Or you might be trying to fit a 1 of in and you're trying to decide whether or not you want to take out a card. You're looking at your options and you're like, well, Ghost Ogre and multiples in your opening hand might not be good. It's still powerful, but I don't want to see multiple copies of it. I can afford to take out a single copy of this to put in this other powerful 1 of. After that, we have cards that we play at 1. Now, this is going to be a bit interesting because sometimes you see really powerful 1-ofs, like this list of 1-ofs here that I'll kind of briefly touch on. And then you have 1-ofs that aren't on the list in any aspect. So sometimes people will look at a list and be like, I wonder why they play 1 of that card. And that's because those cards are generally considered bricks. Now, brick is a term in Yu-Gi-Oh! That just means this card really has no utility in my hand outside of it being a combo piece that is required to be played for other starter cards. So a perfect example of that would be Neospacian Aqua Dolphin. In the Infernoble deck, you use Neospacian Connector to summon Neospacian Aqua Dolphin from your deck to the field, and then Aqua Dolphin uses its effect, potentially rips a card out of your opponent's hand, and then you can go into Isolde. Well, Neospacian Aqua Dolphin is not a 1-card combo. You can normal summon this card and still use its effect to discard a card and look at your opponent's hand, but outside of that, it's not lending you to a full combo, while Neospacian Connector does. This card still has utility, even though it's definitely considered a brick, because if you have another Warrior Extender in your opening hand, you can still make the Isolde combo. It's just not a 1-card combo in and of itself, and you will see this usually played at 1. Now, for a true brick, we have Photon Orbital. Photon Orbital is a card that saw play in ABC, and ABC is a really powerful deck because Buster Dragon in and of itself is a very strong boss monster. Being able to target 1 card in your opponent's field and banish it, and then tribute itself and summon back the 3 pieces you used to make him is extremely strong. However, you do have cards in that deck like Photon Orbital that are just complete bricks if you happen to draw them. Now, Photon Orbital's use in that deck is to be equipped from the deck to a monster on the field via Union Carrier's effect, and then he banishes himself to search a Galaxy monster in which you normally search Galaxy Soldier. However, if this card is in your hand, it does nothing but eat your normal summon. Now, it is a level 4, and it is a light monster, but outside of being a level 4 and its utility to make cards like Daigusto Emerald, maybe Abyss Dweller, and maybe Dugaris, it is completely useless outside of being a combo piece. Now we have PSY-Frame Driver. I like to joke that this card is the best brick in the game, and there's actually a little bit of truth behind that. This card, like Neospacian Aqua Dolphin, isn't dead in your hand if you have an accompanying card like one of the PSY-Frame cards. The PSY-Frame cards can summon themselves from your hand and then summon a driver from deck, but the driver can also be summoned from the hand. So if you open this card in Gamma, it's not technically a dead card. It is still a brick because you would rather have any other card in your deck in your hand besides Driver because it can just be summoned from the deck anyway, but it can still be played. Sometimes you might see people jokingly tribute one of their monsters for Driver if they're already in a winning position, just because it's kind of a meme that Driver is like the biggest brick in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! But its stats are actually relatively imposing. A 2500 beat stick that only requires 1 tribute to summon, and it's also a level 6, which might have some meta relevance when it comes to decks like Virtual World, who utilize level 6s very often to go into their extra deck. So now we're going to move on to cards that are at 1 for a reason, because they are so powerful that they had to be limited, and you want to utilize as many of these cards as humanly possible in your main deck or your side deck or even your extra deck, because they have effects that have warranted them being put to 1. Cards like Pankertops and Armageddon Knight and Terratop. These are extremely powerful cards that are either 1-card combo pieces that get you into your Degenerate combos, or cards that are just an immense bounty that you can summon for free and then remove a resource from your opponent. So if you remember any of the Zoo videos that I've made, you'll see that I side Pankertops and then 2 copies of Beast King Alpha. You know their effects by this point, and they can just freely summon themselves to your field if your opponent controls more monsters than you do. Now the thing that makes Pankertops so strong is it's better than a Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon just requires you control no monsters and your opponent control at least 1 monster. Pankertops' requirement is that your opponent just controls more monsters than you do. So usually this card can be summoned at any point during the turn as long as your opponent still has more monsters than you do. You can be baiting negates, removing resources from your opponent slowly, and then slamming a very strong Pankertops that can either beat over monsters or kind of give you that next little push to start controlling the game. Just like a free Pankertops can beat over a monster, then you have like a pop on your opponent's turn because its effect is a quick effect. And if more decks had cards like these, you would definitely see them played at multiple copies. Same thing goes for Armageddon Knight and Terratop. We did talk about this when we talked about our 1-card combos like Neo Space Connector and Black Metal Dragon. When these cards are summoned in their respective decks, they lent to their full combo. So Armageddon Knight and cards like Dark Grepher were used in Orcus, to where you could just dump one of the Orcus cards and then do your full combo from there. It ended on a very strong board that used Bardiche also, which we'll talk about when we get to the extra deck, to where you would just end on not necessarily an unbreakable board, but a board that a lot of decks just couldn't deal with. The level of recursion and everything that these get you to is just kind of insane. And the same lends themselves to cards like A Hero Lives, where it can just summon any hero from the deck, idly Stratos, that'll search any hero card, Rhoda that searches any warrior, power spells like Heartbeat's Feather Duster and Mind Control, consistency cards like Upstart Goblin and Terraforming that just dig you for multiple copies of, really anything in your deck potentially, or multiple copies of the same card. Cards that also get you to your starter cards like E-Telly for Terratop, or actually E-Telly can't get Terratop because that is a machine and this is a psychic. This would do things like bring out Cosmo Farm Girl and stuff like that in older formats. So this is definitely still at 1 because it can also bring out tuners. In modern day, you would bring out any psychic tuner to kind of go into your needle fiber combos, or to utilize cards like Link Ross and the tokens that they can make to kind of go into blanket negates and stuff like that. Other cards that are just more consistent like Trickstar Light Stage and Spiral Resort. You can basically see a pattern here. Any card that is just like can be used in any deck that doesn't have like any activation requirements that are too insane, like mass removal cards or just super consistency cards, you will see get hit on the list most times. Lastly, you're going to have cards that kind of lend themselves to degenerate strategies like Imperial Order or Skill Drain. If these cards were at multiples, you would have a lot of like Oonga Boonga Monkey decks where they just like set a ton of back row, put 1 big beat stick on the field, and then your opponent just can't interact with you at all. You will see Konami oftentimes semi-limiting or banning or limiting cards like that, just because it lends to an unhealthy play style. If you're able to play cards like these, I definitely recommend it, which is why sometimes you'll see stun decks kind of top here and there, because they can play cards like Skill Drain, where it's just blanket negates, or there can only be 1, where it really shuts down, single archetype decks, like the Warrior deck, something they would utilize Neo Space Connector or like Dragon Link and stuff like that. It really just kind of limits your opponent's ability to interact and play on their turn and on your turn. So now we're going to move to the extra deck, And this is a little more unique than the main deck. In your main deck, you can play 40 to 60 cards and any amount in between, but in your extra deck, you can only play a max of 15 cards. So you really want to have your extra deck narrowed down to cards that are either interacting with your opponent on a turn-to-turn basis, removing resources from your opponent's field to get to the point where you can either control the pace of the game or just end the game that turn, or anything that you can just kind of build up to put negates on the board to make it hard for your opponent to play on the next turn. So we're going to talk about cards that you need to play at 3 because they, in and of themselves, enable your starters. And a card like that would be the new Prank Kids Meow Meow. Now this card is a Link 1, which means it just requires 1 monster to make, and it is a starter for any Prank Kids monster. If you normal summon a Prank Kids monster and go into this, your Prank Kids monster triggers, engrave, summoning another Prank Kids card from deck, and then you just go into your play line of making doodle-doo, searching a card, and it gets you to an end point where you're going to end up with more resources than what you started with. So you want to play 3 of these because you're really normal summon reliant or fusion reliant, and if you can't get to your fusion spells, you want to be able to play like with just 1 Prank Kids monster, and that's what that card allows you to do. So if you're deck building and you have like 1 card starters, like a Prank Kids would be, where you need an extra deck card to start your plays, definitely play 3 of that card. Now we're going to go into utility cards like Nightmare Phoenix and Nightmare Unicorn. While they do have a bit of a heavier cost to make, Nightmare Phoenix being 2 monsters and Nightmare Unicorn being 3 monsters, or any link total equaling 3, they are cards that promote gameplay between you and your opponent. There is going to be interaction there. You are using monsters you control to interact with your opponent's field. Nightmare Phoenix will be popping a spell or trap card on the field, and Nightmare Unicorn will be targeting and shuffling a card back on your opponent's field into their deck. That lends to healthy playstyles. You will not see these cards on the ban list in any way, shape, or form because they're not inherently overpowered. People don't usually play multiple copies of these in their extra deck because, when you're using these, you're either trying to get rid of like maybe floodgates that your opponent controls, or, oppressive spells and traps, or, maybe like a big monster that normally you can't beat over using Unicorn's effect. So they're inherently good, not inherently broken. The cost to make them is basically equivalent to what you're going to be getting out of them in terms of their use. They're just not good enough to be banned, but definitely good enough to be played in your extra deck. Now lastly here, we have cards like Boral Sword Dragon. Now, why this card doesn't see play today very much, because most decks are either very strong in and of their own archetype to where they use their own extra deck monsters to either close out the game or set up unbreakable boards to where they can just kill you on the next turn. Boral Sword is a high-cost card. It takes 3+ effect monsters, and it's a Link 4. So you can't just use cards like Nightmare Unicorn and 1 monster. You would have to use like Nightmare Phoenix and 2 other monsters to make it, because it requires at least 3 effect monsters. So the cost to make this card is heavy, and if you're going to be making this card, you're going to be going for game anyway. So the high cost, it's like, high risk, high reward. If you're going to be making this card, you're putting a lot of your resources into it, but you better be killing your opponent that turn, because outside of Boral Sword Dragon, you might not have a lot of resources left, and if your opponent lives and can mount a comeback, then it's just going to be very, very bad. So you don't see this card oftentimes played right now. You might see it in Dragon Link if they have space for it, but outside of that, you want to be wary of cards like this in your extra deck where, it might seem very powerful because it is, but you might not be able to either afford to make it, or you might just have in-archetype cards that are better than it. Now, very briefly here, we have cards that are at 2 and at 1. This really doesn't have a lot of meta impact, aside from kind of Dryden and Bardiche here. These cards are at 1 because they're just inherently very powerful. This card puts an interruption on your opponent's field. This card basically searches interruption in like a BA/PK deck. But normally, you're not going to see like a deck's boss monster really get hit. One of the outliers, actually 2 outliers for this are totally awesome, and Buster Dragon. On the previous list, they were at 1, and now they're back at 2. I think we'll probably see them come back at 3. Konami must have seen something in them that we didn't. I know Buster Dragon would have been insanely strong had we kept Jet Synchron, as a card that we could play, but unfortunately that card is on the ban list. You can say goodbye to the Degenerate Eldritch 1-card combos where basically there was just infinite amount of resources that your opponent had. Thank God we don't see that anymore. But going back to this here, these cards they're not really warranted at 2. They could definitely come back to 3. Most of the time, like I said, if you're playing a deck, you're not going to see your big bad boss monster in your extra deck get hit unless it's just extremely oppressive. You do see cards like Librarian and Omega and Master Diamond on the list, strictly because they can, and Dulorian, definitely Dulorian, because they lend themselves to like Degenerate OTKs or hand loops or deck loops in the case of Dulorian. They just aren't really fun to play against. A lot of people complain about those. Generally speaking, you're not going to be wanting to play decks like that just because it doesn't make you a better duelist, if you just recycle the same combo, for 50 minutes. Yeah, you've learned how to do that one combo, but a lot of the times, if you play against somebody that's playing a deck like that and you're able to like interrupt them or stop them at any point, they normally don't know how to play through the interruption. And it just kind of like goes to show that decks like this are good for doing one thing, but don't really promote like a healthy game, game sense, game style, gameplay, anything like that. They're not fun to play against, and you're generally going to want to stay away from them. So that wraps up this video on deck building and a little bit of deck theory. I also kind of touched on, maybe why some cards are on the ban list and some aren't. Hopefully that kind of helps in your decision making when you're looking at building a deck. Really kind of focus on those powerful one-ofs that are, multi-archetypal, where they don't take a certain type of deck to play them. Harpy's Feather Duster is one of those. Upstart, it's consistency. So just really kind of focus on making your deck as consistent as possible. Play as many one-card starters as you effectively can in your deck without making it too bricky, and just kind of go from there. If you guys like this video, please let me know in the comments. If you would like to see a more in-depth video when it comes to deck building, let me know. I can definitely talk about like the mathematics behind playing 3-ofs and 2-ofs and 1-ofs and stuff like that. I'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit more if you all are interested. So lastly here, I just want to thank everybody. We are extremely close to 70 subscribers. I think if we push really hard, we could probably break 100 subs by the end of the year. And if we do break 100 subs by the end of the year, I would like to do a giveaway. I would like to give away one of the Starlights from my collection. I will randomly pick one out of my binder. I will select, one of my subscribers on one of my videos. I'll kind of tackle that in a later video the closer that we get to it. But please, if you guys are interested, like this video, comment on it, subscribe to me, and then I will see you next time. Thank you so much.